4-day Republican National Convention begins tonight. 336 delegates gathering to renominate the president in a more traditional convention setting rather than the Democrats' virtual roll call last week.
Trump is slated to speak every night, and tonight Trump and Pence are expected to appear in person at the Charlotte, North Carolina convention site. Senior politics reporter at Vox with a focus on the GOP, Jane Coaston, is here to weigh in on what the RNC means for the Republican Party now and perhaps into the future. Great to see you, Jane.
Good to see you, Jane.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.
So what do you make of this lineup that's been announced and what it kind of says about where the GOP is, what it stands for, and what it all means in the Trump era?
I think it's fascinating that first you see a number of members of the Trump family, which is to be as expected, but also you see a couple of efforts to highlight both the future of the Republican Party, potential nominees for 2024, but also the purported diversity of the Republican Party. So you see Senator Tim Scott having a role. But what you don't see that I think is interesting, and that I know that Seger and I have talked about a lot, is that in 2016, you saw a lot of focus on small business people. You saw a lot of focus on what Trump or the Republican Party viewed as the working class support of the Republican Party. This time, you see a couple of people who got highlighted in viral videos. For instance, Nicholas Sandmann with the MAGA hat and the St. Louis gun-toting people who now apparently owe more than $20,000 in back taxes. So you see a real focus on cultural grievance, as a sense. And I've been saying that this is the most online campaign I have ever seen. And a host of the people who are speaking, if you aren't locked onto Twitter, you might not necessarily know who they are. But if you are a part of a campaign that is largely aimed not so much against Democrats, but against the media, the highlighting of these specific speakers makes perfect sense.
I think that's a very important point, Jane. You and I had recently talked about what Trumpism means and what it could view as. You actually called it back in 2017. You said, what if there is no such thing as Trumpism? Do you kind of see the RNC lineup as that logical conclusion of like grievance with the media and others, but no real positive forward? At least I would say this time, there's not even a pretense of trying to have an economic agenda which is positive.
Right. And you see that a little bit in the Republican National Committee deciding not to really have an agenda and that they'll work out one in 2024, especially because I think that the idea of attempting to come together to develop, say, an economic agenda, which would mean that you'd essentially have to get someone like Senator Josh Hawley and someone like Senator Rand Paul on the same page about an economic agenda. Senator Paul, who said that essentially a recession should be painful, and someone like Senator Josh Hawley, who has been focused largely on dismantling Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, but we'll put that aside, but also on ideas and an economic platform that should, in his view, benefit working class Missourians. And so it's way easier to just say, this is a campaign that is aimed on selling you on why Democrats are bad, rather than coming up with a forward-moving economic agenda. If that would force us to put populists and libertarians in the same room and ask them to come up with an agenda that would work for both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And dig into that a little bit more, because as noteworthy as the people who were selected to speak, equally noteworthy are some of the people like Hawley who were left off the list. What do those sort of absentees mean?
I think that the absences of a Senator Josh Hawley, of a couple of the more populist-leaning conservatives, this might be a little bit too inside baseball, but this is not a Rod Dreher-aimed convention aimed at kind of a nationalist conservative. Sure. This is a convention aimed at, if you think Mitch McConnell is awesome, but don't really want to listen to him talk. And interestingly, Mitch McConnell said last week that, I won't be attending the Republican National Convention, before reversing and saying that he would be. And I think that I've argued for a long time that the populism of Trump, the populism upon which many people projected onto Trump, because Trump was willing to say things like there should be health care for everyone, because he recognized that that's a really popular message, not necessarily there was anything behind that. That kind of populism, while being popular, is also not very popular, I would argue, with the top echelons of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party is very focused on having Senator Tim Scott talk about opportunity zones rather than having Senator Josh Hawley talk about, not just going after China, but also going after big businesses and talking about, stock buybacks for large companies. Because, if there's anything upon which the Democrats and Republicans can agree, it's that big companies making lots of money is awesome and cool.
Right.
Yeah, that opportunity zone crap could have been at either convention, frankly.
Yeah, opportunity zones used to be a Democratic thing, and then it became a Republican thing, Jack Kemp, and there's so much more. I guess, Jane, what it really shows me, it's like you said, it's not just about what our current moment is, but it's about what the so-called agreements are and what that means for 2024. So as like anybody, I'm going to ask you to weigh in here on 2024 and what it might mean if there is a Trump loss or even a Trump win. How do you think that will all play itself out within the party, given the context of that speaker's lineup? Is it going to be the open season, given that, the RNC even said, we have no positions until 2024. We unilaterally support the Trump agenda, whatever that may mean. What exactly are the tea leaves that we can read that are within the speaking list here?
I think that you see within the speaking list the people who the Republican National Committee is very comfortable with. So you see someone like Nikki Haley, and there's always been this weird like Mike Pence is going to get replaced by Nikki Haley thing that is not actually going to happen.
Right.
It's just a lot of bored people on the internet. But you see the idea of what the Republican National Committee is happy with and supportive of. And that has nothing to do with the idea of Trumpism, the idea of populism, but it has to do with someone who can sound good talking about free markets and free minds. And so I think that regardless of what happens in 2020, what you'll see in 2024 is likely a contest between the Republicans who are, I would argue, shaped for this particular moment. Someone like, a Nikki Haley, someone like perhaps a Tom Cotton, though I would argue he probably won't run because that would require him to talk to large groups of people, and that might not go very well. But I think that you would also see that, a lot of the populists who have gained a lot of popularity among conservatives, right, in this particular moment, I'm not sure whether or not they would want to take it to a national audience, whether or not they're, ready for TV, so to speak. So I think that what you'll see here is an effort to bridge Trumpism, which, as I've argued, is just whatever Trump is into at this particular moment, to a wider conservative Republican agenda, with the reminder that conservatism and the Republican agenda are not often the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And Jane, on Trump himself, he's going to speak every day of this thing. Number one, what do you expect to hear from him? And number two, what happened here? Because at least in 2016, he knew some of the right things to say. You pointed to healthcare, infrastructure, on entitlements, pledging I will never cut Social Security and Medicare. This time around, he's getting rid of the payroll tax cut, which funded those programs. So did he just completely lose touch with the electorate? Did he have too many, of the sort of traditional conservative establishment types in his ear? Did he ever believe any of the things that he was saying? What is your read on all of that?
So to your first question of what he'll talk about, I think that he's going to talk about how his agenda best matches with what the American populace wants. And he's attempting to thread what I think is a challenging needle, but no one listens to me, which is to say that bad things would happen under a Biden presidency, even though those bad things are currently happening under a Trump presidency, but that's different for some reason. But as to your second question, I think in some ways what Trump really effectively noted in 2015 and 2016 was not anything that he really believed, except for his belief in the power of debt and his distrust of American trade policy. What I think he recognized is that if he was the one Republican who, while everyone was yelling at Jeb Bush, could say that everyone should have health care and the Iraq war was a bad idea, both of which are very popular ideas, he could gain a lot of support while seeming as if he's this raconteur. If you'll remember, the focus of the National Review against Trump issue, which now feels like it's aged like old milk, was not necessarily that he was a bad person, but that he was not a conservative, to which, to quote the movie The Fugitive, a lot of Republicans didn't care. And so what I think, though, you're hearing now with the focus on suburban housewives and the beautiful boaters, is that the messaging is very challenging to make with a Republican Party that is very focused on attempting to keep control of the Senate, which it believes it has to do with, quote unquote, suburban housewives and beautiful boaters. And so I think that it's not necessarily that Trump has been influenced. It's that Trump's viewpoints on these issues, except on debt and on trade policy, have been easy to shift with the winds. And especially because I think that so much of his 2016 promise was based not necessarily on being Trump, but being not Hillary Clinton and being not a part of the quote unquote establishment, which is why people could see, this is going to be the immigration restrictionist of my dreams. This is going to be the best friend of Republicans we've ever seen, or evangelicals. This is going to be the most pro-LGBTQ president. He's going to be everything I have ever wanted in my entire life. And I just look at him and see that. And in 2020, he has to somehow do that again while we have 4 years of his actual presidency to look at.
Right.
So I think that you're going to see what you would see in this week is a focus on his accomplishments, but also the argument that he could have done so much more if it hadn't been for those dastardly Democrats or the mean media or something like that. And I would also note that what he has been able to get done, specifically on the issue of immigration, has not been that popular, except with immigration restrictionists. So I think that, if you're not perhaps Stephen Miller, and fortunately most of us are not, a lot of that is going to be a hard case to make while also trying to thread the needle to middle America. And it's interesting. Sometimes we talk about middle America as if it is just a bunch of Republicans, but actually most people are far more centrist and their politics are far more heterodox than we give them credit to.
We talk about that here all the time.
So I think that this is a convention that is like the Democratic National Convention, when a lot of people were surprised that you didn't hear from more left-leaning or progressive voices. They're like, well, that's not their aim. They're kind of assuming that those people are not going to vote for Donald Trump. So I think that what you're going to see this week, especially with he's going to be mentioning criminal justice reform again, which some people wanted him to change that messaging. You're going to see a play towards the purported middle, an idea that the Democrats have gone too far left and we're the only sane option, which ironically is the exact same message we heard last week, just in reverse.
Everybody working overtime for that John Kasich coalition.
That's right.
Jane, so great to have you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Jane.
Thanks so much for having me.
Next on Rising, an unexpected primary victory in Kansas has sparked controversy over a progressive named Aaron Coleman. Journalist Zed Jelani is going to talk about that rise and fall when Rising returns.